Meet I.M. Pei, the architect behind these works. In 1935, I.M. Pei entered the States as a student, one of the few exempt classes of Chinese who were permitted legal admission into the States. As a banker's son, he came to study architecture first at the University of Pennsylvania, but then transferred to MIT and continued to Harvard University for graduate study. Pei anticipated returning to China for work, but because of political hardships back home, such as the Sino-Japanese War, he remained in the U.S. where he was recognized for many of his projects. Upon graduating in 1940, he received the Alpha Rho Chi Medal, the MIT Traveling Fellowship, the AIA Gold Medal, and continued his studies at Harvard with leading architects. Because of him and other Chinese students who gained special recognition for their achievements, Congress made legal financial provisions for Chinese students. In the mid-1950s, the Department of State saw ways for students to gain permanent residence and eventually citizenship in the United States. I.M. Pei and others in their cohort of student refugees, such as the Nobel Prize-winning physicists Li Zhengdao and Yang Zhengning, are early examples of the phenomenon later criticized in the 1960s as the brain drain. However, the image of Chinese Americans as educated intellectuals was vastly different just 100 years ago. In the late 1840s, the Chinese heard of the discovery of a single fragment of gold in the United States, sparking a dream that was pursued for over half a decade. This phenomenon was known as the California Gold Rush.
The gold rush was advertised in South China, in the Pearl River Delta area around what was then called Canton, Guangzhou. And the Chinese jumped aboard ships. Sometimes they paid their way, they had their family pay their way. They had a sort of high stakes trip to the United States. And they landed in San Francisco.
In the 1850s, political unrest and economic pressures at home prompted thousands of Chinese immigrants to move to the western regions of the United States in search of temporary work.
These people were met at the docks by representatives of their hometown districts. And these districts and these organizations that they had were called Tongs, T-O-N-G. So the Tongs were what in Chinese is called Huiguang. They're hometown association, region associations. And so these immigrants, Chinese wanting to get rich by going to the gold rush, they went off to the gold fields, organized into large groups according to where they came from in China. But it's all in South China, all in the districts right around Hong Kong and Canton. So they came, and then they usually left. Some stayed because there was sort of business opportunities, because California grew quickly. By 1855, the population of California was composed of 10% Chinese. The Chinese were quite successful in the gold fields. But the railroads were started by that time, even before that.
U.S. railroad companies were expanding at a fast pace, straining to span the continents as quickly and cheaply as they could. Because the work was brutally difficult, workers were injured and killed at a very high rate. However, for Chinese laborers, it represented one of the scarce opportunities to enter the workforce, so they were forced to accept lower wages than many native-born U.S. workers would have. On the Central Pacific Railroad alone, more than 10,000 Chinese workers blasted tunnels, built roadbeds, and laid hundreds of miles of track, often in the freezing cold or searing heat. The railroads could have never been completed as quickly as they were without the hundreds of Chinese men who lost their lives completing this dangerous task. Upon settling in America, Chinese newcomers often found themselves isolated from their white counterparts. Chinese Americans and other immigrants competed for jobs typically reserved for the Europeans, leading to severe racial tensions. Eventually, as this tension increased, it entered the political sphere, where it took the form of anti-Chinese riots and campaigns. Anti-Chinese sentiments became so widespread that presidential candidates of both the Democratic and Republican parties in 1876 and 1880 used anti-Chinese slogans to gain popular support from voters. And in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, restricting the entry of Chinese laborers for a period of 10 years, with exemptions for teachers, students, merchants, and travelers. This was the first law in American history to place a broad restriction on immigration. As the Exclusion Act was about to expire in 1892, Congress voted to renew exclusion for another 10 years in accordance with the Geary Act. In 1902, the prohibition was expanded to restrict immigrants from Hawaii and the Philippines, despite facing strong objections from the Chinese government and its citizens. 2 years later, in 1904, Chinese immigration was declared permanently illegal. Although the federal government still denied citizenship to Chinese immigrants, opportunities for employment were abundant, and waves of Chinese immigrants continued. However, the U.S. government continued to restrict the rights of the Chinese in America. In 1910, Angel Island, an island located near San Francisco, became the main processing center for incoming immigrants, but it also doubled as the Chinese immigrants' worst nightmare. Hundreds, if not thousands, of paper sons arrived, non-relatives who had begged, borrowed, or purchased their way into a family of Chinese Americans, carrying false papers for proof. In 1924, the U.S. Congress responded to these frauds by passing an immigration law that prohibited further immigration from Asia. Those who were already in the United States could remain, but could not bring their families, and could not become citizens either. Many of these paper sons faced deportation. In addition, many states implemented miscegenation laws and land ownership laws. Only during the late 19th and early 20th centuries were these laws repealed by President Roosevelt, granting citizenship to many. However, Congress set up a quota system in place to allow only 105 new Chinese immigrants per year.
Asian immigrants no longer came to America looking for cheap labor, but to obtain a Western education to bring back home with them. Even though Chinese laborers were restricted, Chinese students were admissible and viewed as a means to straighten diplomatic measures between America and China. Despite this new attitude towards Chinese immigrants, they were still paid low wages and forced to settle in Chinatowns across the country. Whites blamed the Chinese for removing job opportunities and sought extreme measures in retaliation. Some of the worst episodes of anti-Chinese violence occurred in the West in cities like Seattle and Denver. As a result, many Chinese fled to the East and established their own community, known as Chinatowns. Organizations in Chinatowns provided legal services to immigrants who wasn't protected by the benefits of U.S. citizenship. As Professor Alan Wu said, Chinatowns were the product of extreme forms of racial segregation. That's how Chinatowns came into being, not how we think of them now as fun places to get a meal, but as a way to contain the very threatening population in American life. During the 1950s, thousands of Chinese citizens from Taiwan came to the United States to study at American universities. However, studying in America was one thing, and staying here was another. Chinese nationals could stay in America only if they were employed after graduation. If they failed to find work, they had to remain in school or return to China. Finally, in 1965, Congress passed the Hart-Celler Act, removing the national origin basis for immigration. The American government established an annual quota that enabled 20,000 Chinese to receive U.S. citizenship to mirror the quota of other countries around the world. Thousands who had been in the U.S. for 10 or more years could now apply for permanent residency, and the Chinese who were granted permanent residency were finally granted the ability to apply for nationality.
Then the Tiananmen Square incident occurred in the spring of 1989. The incident was composed of a number of student-led demonstrations and protests in Beijing, protesting for more individual rights and freedom. The Chinese Communist Party termed this bourgeois liberalism. The incident was catalyzed by the death of Hu Yaobang, the general secretary of the CCP who had encouraged democratic reform. He was deemed a political martyr for the common cause of the students, and on April 22nd, the date of his funeral, tens of thousands of students gathered at Tiananmen Square to protest for democratic reform. Ultimately, the Tiananmen Square incident culminated when the Chinese government intervened on the demonstrations and violently suppressed the protests, leading to the massacre of June 4, 1989. The government sent 50 trucks and as many as 10,000 troops to Tiananmen Square to begin a violent suppression of the protesting crowds. They opened fire on groups of students, resorting to deadly violence when met with resistance from the protesters. Even today, the government censors and denies the occurrence of this incident, even blocking the combinations of the numbers 6, 4, and 1989 as allusion to the massacre. This incident also caused an increase in immigration to the United States as a way to escape the political conflict and its after effects.
Well, for me, summer of 1998, something extraordinary happened. A student movement calling for reform on the political system in China. It was led to in 1989, June 4th, 1989. It was later regarded in history as the Tiananmen Square massacre. And I was in college at the time, me and my brother both. We were part of the student demonstration group. We went out the street. We really felt that the political system in China needed to change, and we felt strongly about that. But as you know, after the June 4th, all of a sudden the political atmosphere changed for the worse. I just couldn't see hope at all. And incidentally, at the time, my parents were both here in the States, and my boyfriend at the time. So it was clear for me that I wanted to leave China. I just didn't see my future there at all. I felt very oppressed.
Thus, this brings us to the era where there is the highest demand for visas and entrance to the US from China. There are many ways that Chinese immigrants obtain their visas. For starters, there were two main types of visas, immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas, and within these were many subcategories of visas.
When you talk about visas, there are two concepts involved, and one is called an immigrant visa, one is called a non-immigrant visa. Non-immigrant visa is for people to come here to live and work temporarily, and an immigrant visa is a green card for people to live here permanently. There's several categories for green card. Shortage-based, you have to certify there's a shortage of U.S. workers. Second category is achievement-based, is based on your achievements, because you won Olympic gold medal, you won Oscar, of course those are common ones, you won Nobel Prize. So the third category is investment-based, so because you invest money in the U.S., you create jobs for U.S. workers. The fourth category will be marriage-based, you have a family here in the U.S. The fifth category will be asylum refugee, because you fear persecution to return home. There's another category called diversity lottery. So each year, U.S., in order to balance the immigrant pool, because it tends to be, some countries have a lot more people coming, like China, India, Mexico, Philippines. And so there was a law allow those people from those countries to immigrate by lottery. And there were 50,000 numbers available every year. They can just participate in lottery if they want, they can immigrate here.
In the early years of modern-day immigration, the majority of prospective immigrants wanted to move to America in search of jobs and a better life for their children.
I do believe that it played a role because my brother was born in China and I was conceived in China, so they had to move to America to have me.
刚开始只是想来学习，是过了几年，有可能是就是到了第2年、第3年，我才逐渐有这个想法，觉得应该留在美国。然后等着坨就是王思路他们来到美国之后，做了一段时间，就感觉更应该留在美国了。主要是美国对孩子好。
I think the benefits the U.S. honestly the people, the more well-to-do people immigrate to the U.S. There's two reasons. One is for kids' education, one is for clean environment. So what attracts them for the U.S. education is that because in China, school is really hard for kids, and even 6-7-year-olds that have to do homework until 1 o'clock in the 12 o'clock midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. It's very driven by schools, by tests, and so the teacher are incentivized based on how high what the students' test score is, the admission rate. So so everything is also incentivized and driving students to high test score. So the school is really pressure cookers, and the students, even ever since they're little, they go to school like 6, 7 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the morning. They do homework until midnight. It's very common. So the parents now in China mostly only have one kid. They really don't want the kids they don't feel like this is good for the kids. And the schools, they don't believe the school is focused on creativity, problem solving. Is more on test score. So they wanted to get the kids, because they're well-to-do, they want the kids come to the U.S. They feel the U.S. system more focused on creativity, problem solving, and the kids don't have to work, do homework until midnight every day. And also the clean air, they feel it's clean food. Also another reason, they feel like U.S. has a more stable political system. And the U.S. college, they feel, in China it's kind of interesting that it's harder to get into college. Once you're into college, people just kind of, you don't have to do anything, you just get a bad. They don't really study that hard. But the U.S. is the opposite. It's not too hard to get into early college, but once you're in college, you have to study pretty hard to graduate. So in China, it's the opposite. They felt like the kids come to the U.S. have a better education. So that's the belief. Yeah, that's what attracts them here.
However, in recent years, Chinese immigration has seen a spike in the number of immigrants choosing to move back to China, and it is predicted that within the next few decades, the flow of immigrants from China will dry up rapidly.
我回中国的目的是，自己家乡朋友多，亲戚多，也好玩儿。
I think the early days, almost all the Chinese students who come here, they want to stay, because China those days are not as developed. The living condition in China is not not as that good compared with the U.S. There's a big difference in living standard. In early days, back 20 years ago, almost all the Chinese students want to stay. Right now it's different, because China right now, especially in the first tier cities, that have pretty much everything that you can buy in the U.S. Living standards really pretty much improved. They're really comfortable. They can live very comfortable life in China, probably better than here. So quite a few students wanted to go back. I would say if the students come here right now, they stay not because the living condition much different. It's more for they enjoy the fresh air here, the clean environment. The early days students want to stay here because they feel like there's more opportunity in the U.S., better jobs, and they can live a better life. Nowadays, because all the Chinese students come to here, most of them pretty well to do with the family. They live a very comfortable life if they go back to China. They want to stay more. They like the U.S. clean environment, clean food, no pollution, and they more like the American lifestyle. It's simpler lifestyle. So, but there are quite a few students who do want to go back nowadays. I would say at least for the next 5 years, I'd say that people. At least I think for another 5 years, immigration will still be something people will consider. However, that because the visa backlog, it takes so long to get here. If without giving more visa number to Chinese national for the EB-5 program, I'd say you will see gradually reduce of interest in the EB-5. As a matter of fact, I already have many clients decide not to immigrate to the U.S. because just the wait is too long. They decide to go to other countries. I'd say the hardest challenge for them to face is the visa backlog, because in the U.S. the visa has a quota system. Each country only entitled certain percentage as a quota, because there's a lot of Chinese immigrate here. The more Chinese immigrate here than in other countries like India, so there's long wait for green card. Let's say if you're investor from Europe, you can invest $500,000 get a green card probably less than less than 2 years, but a Chinese investor could be 10, 12 years. So I think the biggest challenge for them is the visa quota.
Although the demographics and motivations of immigration have shifted throughout the years, Chinese immigrants, both first and second generation, still face many common challenges in America, including the learning of languages, the difficulties of assimilating to American culture, and anti-immigrant discrimination.
我移民的困难是语言不通，流程不同， 心情紧张，语言那个文化不高。
请问你期望美国在移民前怎么样？
What was hard for me really was figuring out how to fit in, I think. Because it's totally different what you have to get used to, and just making friends is immensely difficult. Like the first year, a lot of it was, it was third grade, I was still learning English, and I didn't fit in with anybody there. I didn't even know how like the school cafeteria lines worked and things like that. So a lot of it was just, really relying on the teachers who were very understanding of my situation, learning English, which was, probably the hardest part. And then after that, trying to actually fit in and get close to a good group of people. It eventually worked out for me, but it did take about a year or so for me to get settled in.
It's hard to put aside and sort of differentiate the different cultures, because living in an immigrant family in America, the cultures are often mixed together.
Many of these Chinese Americans here, they struggle financially quite a bit, and they work very hard and they struggle to get by comfortably. There's this stereotype that Chinese immigrants here are very wealthy and live a very comfortable life and pretty well off because of the connections in China. While this is true for a lot, there's also a lot of them, this stereotype does not apply to them at all. They live a pretty, almost opposite life of that.
Whenever I usually go somewhere and there's a white person I would have to talk to, they would assume that my English learning is not that good, and they would have to usually slow down their talking so that I would understand, but they don't really know that I was born and raised in America. So because of that, they would make assumptions about Asian Americans where we would not be able to speak the American language.
Today, the Chinese are the United States' third largest immigrant group, with 2 million immigrants settling in the United States. They are also the fastest growing group of immigrants in the U.S. However, representation of this keystone immigration population is often overlooked and ignored in both history books and popular culture. In fact, the only TV show on U.S. air that currently talks about the struggles that Asian American people face is Fresh Off the Boat, based on immigrant Eddie Huang and his family's struggles as Chinese immigrants in a foreign country.
Louis, you didn't tell me Allison was Chinese. This is the only surprise you've ever given me that I've liked.
I'd like to present you with a traditional gift of oranges. I buy them wholesale.
Yes. Eddie, shut the door. Shut the door. Shut the door. Shut the door. Our parents made sure we knew where we came from. We need to do the same thing for the boys.
Where are the boys anyway?
翻到课本里38页，今天有3位新同学在我们这班上。
Amazing. Can anyone point out our ancestors in this painting? No, that's right, you can't, because they're not there. Eventually, they will be way back in this field, buried underneath the railroad tracks that they built with no food or water.
However, through the struggles of Chinese Americans, a thriving syncretic Chinese American culture was born and embraced across the nation, monuments were built, economies rose, and a new representation of what it meant to be American was born. In this way, the stories of these people and the roots they have left in America must never be forgotten.